The small coffee shop in the city center was a haven for workers starting their day, students reviewing their notes, and police officers on patrol taking a break. That morning, the smell of fresh coffee and the muffled sound of conversations filled the air. The door opened with the soft jingle of a bell, and two young police officers entered with determined steps, impeccable uniforms, and relaxed smiles. "Good morning, Millie," greeted Jake, the more talkative of the two, as he approached the counter with his usual enthusiasm. Millie, the young barista, returned the smile automatically while taking another customer's order. She was already used to Jake's exuberant demeanor. His partner, Ryan, quieter and more reserved, merely gave a polite nod before sitting at one of the nearby tables. While Millie was serving an espresso to another customer, the door opened again. This time, an elderly man entered. He wore a heavy coat that seemed to have withstood many seasons and carried a simple but sturdy cane. He was burdened with a stack of books and a worn notebook, along with a folded newspaper tucked under his arm. His movements were slow, and his eyes scanned the room before choosing a corner table, far from the bustle. Jake immediately noticed the arrival of the elderly man. "Look who's here," he commented loudly to Ryan, a sarcastic smile playing on his lips. "Our favorite professor. He must be plotting solutions to the world's problems with those notebooks." Ryan gave a hesitant smile. "Leave the man alone, Jake," he murmured, glancing at the old man, who was meticulously arranging his belongings on the table. Edward Wells, as few in the neighborhood knew, was a regular at the coffee shop. He always chose the same corner table, made the same order, black coffee and buttered bread, and spent time writing in his notebook or reading the newspaper. His meticulous and quiet behavior made him seem eccentric, but he appeared comfortable with his routine. Jake wasn't ready to drop the subject. "I bet he has conspiracy theories in those notebooks," he joked, lowering his voice to avoid drawing the old man's attention. Millie, who was behind the counter preparing the officer's orders, overheard the remark and paused for a moment. She looked at Jake with a serious expression. "Maybe he has more to teach than you imagine," she replied curtly, placing the cups on the counter. Jake raised his hands in an exaggerated gesture of surrender but couldn't resist one last comment. All right. But you have to admit he's at least peculiar." Edward, oblivious or perhaps deliberately indifferent to the conversations, opened his notebook and began writing. There was a serenity in his movements, as if he were in a completely different world from the rest of the coffee shop. His handwriting was precise, each word placed on the paper with intention. When Millie approached to take Edward's order, she tried to lighten the atmosphere. "Good morning, Mr. Wells." "The usual?" she asked with a polite smile. Edward raised his eyes and nodded. "Yes, the usual." "Thank you, Millie," he replied in a calm and courteous voice. As Millie walked away to prepare his order, Jake whispered something to Ryan, but this time his colleague didn't respond. While serving the coffee and buttered bread, Millie noticed something peculiar. There was a gleam in Edward's eyes that seemed to contradict the simplicity of his appearance. She thought about asking what he was writing but decided not to interrupt. Edward seemed focused, almost as if he were having an internal dialogue. "Maybe he's a genius," Ryan said quietly, without looking directly at Jake. Jake shrugged. "Or maybe he's just another quirky old man. Who knows?" Edward continued writing, undisturbed. His notebook was a mystery that, for some reason, Millie felt an increasing curiosity to unravel. What drove a man like him to frequent that place every day, always with the same books and the same routine? Was he a writer? A retired professor? Or something completely different? As the coffee shop grew busier, Millie cast another glance at Edward. There was something about him that seemed to resist time and people's assumptions. Little did she know that this day, which had started like any other, would change everyone's perspective on the man who occupied that corner table. The bustle of the coffee shop continued to ebb and flow. Millie, swift and attentive, balanced customer demands while occasionally casting curious glances at Edward. Something about his posture, the way his fingers held the pen, or how his eyes moved across the pages of his notebook, seemed wrapped in mystery. despite his calm demeanor, there was a depth in his expression that inspired a mix of respect and curiosity. Jake, noticing Millie's attention to the old man, shook his head with a cynical smile. "Are you really interested in that guy? Maybe he has some incredible life story, or he's just figuring out how to win the lottery," he joked, his voice low enough not to be overheard by Edward. "Maybe you should ask him instead of mocking him," Millie replied, her tone firm but without hostility. Ryan, who had remained silent until then, glanced at Jake and added, "She's right. We don't even know who he is. What if he's someone important?" Jake shrugged. "Fine, Sherlock. Be my guest and investigate. I'm just saying he looks peculiar." Millie finished preparing Edward's order, a cup of black coffee with perfectly toasted buttered bread. With a polite smile, she carried the tray to his table. "Your order, Mr. Wells," she said, carefully placing the coffee and bread in front of him. Edward raised his eyes briefly and replied, "Thank you, my dear," before turning his attention back to his notebook. Millie hesitated before walking away, her curiosity growing. Almost at the same moment, Edward seemed lost in thought, and as he moved the notebook aside, a photograph fell out. "Oh, Mr. Wells, let me help you," said Millie, rushing to pick up the photo before it hit the floor. When her eyes landed on the image, something inside her made her pause for a moment. It was a black and white photograph of a young man in a military uniform, surrounded by other soldiers. On the back, there was a note, 1944, Normandy. Is this your photo?" Millie asked cautiously, handing the image back to him. Edward smiled faintly, his eyes reflecting both pride and sorrow. "Yes. It was taken during the war. I was a field medic." The weight of his words hit her like a silent wave. You fought in World War II?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. The atmosphere around them seemed to slow down. Jake, overhearing the conversation, stopped sipping his coffee and exchanged a quick glance with Ryan. Both fell silent, as if Edward's presence had suddenly taken on greater significance. Jake seemed uncomfortable, the mocking words he'd said earlier now sounded foolish even to him. Edward nodded but said nothing more. Sensing the tension and not wanting to press him, Millie replied with a gentle smile, "There must be so many stories behind that photo. I'd love to hear them if you ever feel like sharing." Edward looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. He leaned back slightly in his chair, letting the pen rest on the notebook. For a moment, he seemed to ponder. "Stories," he repeated almost to himself. "Yes, I have some. But they're not easy to tell." Jake, now clearly intrigued, leaned forward slightly, trying to listen more closely. "Excuse me, sir," he said, interrupting hesitantly. "But if it's true that you fought in the war, why have you never mentioned it before? Why do you just sit here every day with those books and notebooks?" Edward turned to him with a serene expression. "Not all stories need to be told immediately, young man. Sometimes, they need someone willing to listen." Jake fell silent, unable to respond to that observation. Millie, wanting to break the tension, smiled again. "Well, I'm willing to listen if that helps. And I bet these two would like to hear more too," she said, looking at the officers. Ryan nodded quickly, while Jake averted his eyes but didn't protest. Edward studied the faces in front of him for a moment before taking a deep breath. "Very well," he said, straightening up in his chair. "If you really want to know, I'll tell you how a young doctor ended up in the middle of one of the greatest wars this world has ever seen." The atmosphere in the coffee shop seemed to shift. The surrounding noises grew distant, and all attention was now on Edward. He picked up the photograph again, running his finger gently over it before placing it in the center of the table. "But know this," he warned, "these are not stories of glory. They are stories of survival." Millie and the officers leaned in slightly, fully focused. Edward began his narrative, and everyone realized that this was the beginning of something much bigger. Edward adjusted the position of the medal on the table, his rough fingers sliding over the golden surface. He looked at Millie and the two police officers as if assessing whether he truly wanted to open those doors to the past. After a moment of silence, he began. When the war started, I wasn't much different from any other young man my age, he said. Full of dreams but without much direction. I was in medical school, passionate about learning how to save lives. I never thought I'd have to use that knowledge on a battlefield. Edward's eyes fixed on the photo, as though he were diving directly into his memories. In 1943, I was drafted. There was no time for hesitation. I was assigned as a field medic, trained to deal with injuries I had only read about in books. When I arrived in Europe, I realized no amount of training could prepare you for that. He began recounting his arrival in Normandy, describing the chaos of the battlefield. He spoke about the deafening sounds of explosions, the smell of gunpowder and earth, and the constant cries of wounded soldiers. He described one specific day that left a permanent mark on him. There was a young man, not much older than you two, he said, glancing at Jake and Ryan. His name was Danny. He'd been shot in the leg and was losing a lot of blood. I did what I could right there, in the middle of crossfire. I amputated his leg with whatever tools I had available. It wasn't pretty, but he survived. The officers exchanged glances, visibly impacted by the rawness of the narrative. He survived, Edward repeated, his tone softer. But he was never the same. I remember how he looked at me afterward, grateful and devastated at the same time. He knew he was alive, but he also knew he'd never be the same boy who had left home. And what about you? Millie asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. How did you cope with all of that? Edward hesitated before answering. I coped the best I could. At night, I wrote letters to Margaret. She was my refuge, even though she was an ocean away. He pulled a small photo from inside his notebook and showed it to Millie. It was of a young woman with light hair and a gentle smile. Margaret was my fiancée, he said, with a faintly melancholic smile. I promised her I'd come back. And I did, but she wasn't there anymore. The silence in the coffee shop was palpable. Millie took the photo, holding it delicately, as though she could feel the weight of the story behind it. What happened? She asked. Edward sighed deeply. When I returned, I found out she had fallen ill. A fever no one could diagnose. She passed away weeks before my return. I spent the entire war imagining the day I'd see her again, but... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Jake, who had been silent until then, cleared his throat, clearly moved. And what did you do after that? I lived, Edward answered simply. I continued practicing medicine, but I never again felt like I truly belonged anywhere. Margaret was my anchor. When I lost her, I dedicated myself to saving others, but I never found the same meaning she gave me. Edward looked at the medal again, holding it between his fingers. They gave me this because they said I saved many lives. But every night, I remembered the ones I couldn't save. That weight, it never leaves you. Ryan, who until then had been quietly absorbing Edward's words, finally spoke. My grandfather, he also fought in the war. I don't think he ever managed to talk about it. He always said he didn't want to relive the horrors. Edward looked at him with understanding. Your grandfather wasn't alone. Many of us came home, but we left parts of ourselves there. Jake lowered his gaze, ashamed of his earlier remarks. He opened his mouth as if to say something but decided against it. Millie, sensing the tension in the air, tried to lighten the moment. Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Wells. Your story is important, not just to us but to anyone who still believes heroes only exist in movies. Edward smiled faintly. Heroes aren't made of glory, my dear. They're made of sacrifice. The muffled sound of cups being stacked and quiet conversations filled the coffee shop, but around Edward's table, everything seemed suspended. Millie continued holding the medal, her fingers tracing the golden engravings with reverence. She returned it to Edward carefully, as if handing back a piece of his soul. It's incredible, she said softly. You carried so much, and yet here you are, so calm. It's hard to imagine what it was like there. Edward took the medal and put it back into his pocket, his movements slow, almost ritualistic. It's not something easy to explain. Many of us came home, but we never really left the battlefield. Ryan leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table, looking at Edward with a mix of admiration and curiosity. "Mr. Wells, you mentioned you were friends with my grandfather. William Carter. Could you tell me more about him?" He never wanted to talk much about the war. Edward's eyes brightened for a moment, as though William's name transported him directly to the past. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over the table, his expression heavy with nostalgia. "Will Carter," he began, almost in a whisper. "He was an exceptional man. He was strong, determined, and, above all, he had a huge heart. In war, it's easy to lose your humanity, but Will, he never let that happen. He always made sure we remembered we were more than soldiers. We were brothers." Ryan remained silent, absorbing every word. "My grandfather, he never mentioned that. He always said it was something he preferred to forget." Edward nodded slowly. "Many of us think that way. But there are things worth remembering. Like the day Will almost lost his life." Edward began recounting a specific moment from the war, his voice gaining a weight that silenced everyone around. "It was a dangerous mission. An ambush. The enemy was everywhere, and shots were coming from all directions. Will was hit in the leg and fell. I was just a few meters away, trying to tend to another soldier. When I noticed, I ran to him and managed to drag him into a trench before it was too late." He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I lost count of how many men we lost that day. But Will was one of the ones I managed to save. And do you know what he did after being treated?" He laughed. He said it was the closest thing to an adventure he'd ever lived through. Edward chuckled briefly, but the laugh quickly gave way to a sigh. He always found the bright side, even in the darkest moments. Jake, who had remained silent until now, scratched the back of his neck, visibly uncomfortable. "So, you and Ryan's grandfather were friends? That's kind of surreal. I mean, you knew someone who, well, who's so closely tied to him here and now." Edward looked at Jake with a serene smile. "The war did that. It united us in ways time can't erase. Will and I had a bond one never had with anyone else." Ryan, clearly emotional, asked, "Do you think he still remembers you?" Edward pondered for a moment before answering. "I don't know. Many years have passed. But I remember him, and that's enough for me. The important thing is that he had the chance to come home, to build a family. That was the real victory." The silence among the officers was broken by Millie, who felt the need to ease the intensity of the conversation. "Mr. Wells, this is something that needs to be shared, not just with us, but with others as well. Your stories can't be forgotten." Edward smiled faintly. "Stories are just that, stories. But if they can help someone understand the value of life, perhaps they're worth telling." Jake, trying to redeem himself for his earlier comments, leaned forward slightly. "Have you ever thought about writing it all down? I mean, your stories could inspire a lot of people." Edward shook his head. "I was never a man of grand gestures. Writing isn't for me. I'd rather let life speak for me." Jake and Ryan exchanged glances, both visibly affected by Edward's words. There was a new understanding on their faces, as though something within them had shifted. "Mr. Wells," Ryan began, his voice laden with emotion, "if you'd like, I could try to reconnect you with my grandfather. I'm sure he'd remember you." Edward raised an eyebrow, surprised but not indifferent to the idea. "If that's possible, it would be good to see an old friend again. But only if it's something he wants to." Ryan nodded, clearly determined. Millie watched everything with a satisfied smile, feeling that she was witnessing something much greater than a simple conversation. Edward stood up slowly, putting on his coat and gathering the books under his arm. He looked at the young officers and then at Millie. "Thank you for listening. Sometimes, all we need is someone willing to listen." The atmosphere in the coffee shop, previously heavy with the weight of Edward's memories, now felt lighter, though still intense. Ryan and Jake remained seated, thoughtful. Millie, behind the counter, observed them while carefully cleaning a cup. There was something different about their demeanor, especially Jake's, who seemed nervous, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know where to start. Edward, on the other hand, appeared calm. He finished his coffee in silence, gazing out the window as the sunlight lit up the busy streets. He adjusted the metal in his coat pocket and closed his notebook, ready to leave. "Mr. Wells," Ryan said, breaking the silence. Edward stopped and looked at the young officer, raising an eyebrow. I wanted to apologize," Ryan continued, clearly uncomfortable. "For everything. For how he treated you at first. It was disrespectful, and I'm sorry." Edward remained silent for a moment, studying Ryan's face. "I appreciate your words," he replied calmly. "But you don't need to apologize. You're young. Sometimes youth makes us act without thinking." Jake, usually the more outspoken of the two, now seemed to struggle to find the right words. Finally, he took a deep breath and joined his partner. "You're right. We were stupid. I was stupid. There's no excuse, but I promise to be better. I'll think before I act and show more respect to people." Edward leaned forward slightly, crossing his hands over his cane. "Respect," he began, "is not something you demand. It's something you earn and, more importantly, something you give. You are police officers. You are badges that represent more than authority. They represent responsibility, duty, and the trust of those you've sworn to protect. That's heavier than any medal I've ever received." Millie, standing near the counter, watched the scene with a faint smile. Edward continued, his tone firmer but still kind. "You chose this profession because you believe you can make a difference. So, do it. Don't let cynicism or the rush of daily life overshadow the purpose of what you do. Every person you meet, every word you say, leaves a mark. Make sure it's a positive one." Ryan nodded vigorously, his eyes reflecting both respect and determination. Jake lowered his head for a moment, clearly affected, before looking back at Edward. "Thank you, Mr. Wells," he said, his voice serious. "I needed to hear that." Edward smiled faintly. "Thank you for listening. Sometimes, all we need is someone willing to listen." Edward adjusted his coat and picked up his books, preparing to leave. Before reaching the door, he paused and looked at Millie. "My dear, thank you for the coffee and for your patience with this old man. You have a good heart." Millie smiled, her eyes slightly glistening. "It's not every day we get to hear such an incredible story. You're always welcome here." Edward nodded, satisfied, and opened the door. The bell chimed, marking his departure. He slowly disappeared into the bustling streets. Jake and Ryan remained seated in silence, as though still processing everything they had experienced that morning. It was Millie who broke the silence. "He's something special, isn't he?" she remarked as she cleaned the table where Edward had been sitting. That's when she noticed a carefully folded piece of paper left beside the notebook Edward had taken with him. "He forgot this," Millie said, picking up the paper. Ryan and Jake looked on curiously as she unfolded it. The words on the paper were simple but heavy with meaning. "Sometimes, heroes don't return. But their stories must continue." Beneath these words was a list of names. Soldiers Edward had saved during the war but who had not returned home. Millie looked at the officers, holding the paper delicately. "This is so sad," she said, the weight of the words evident in her voice. "It seems like such a heavy burden. Maybe we can do something." Ryan took the paper, read it silently, and nodded. "I know exactly what we need to do." Ryan wasted no time. As soon as he left the coffee shop that day, he decided to visit his grandfather, William Carter. He entered the house with determined steps, holding Edward's photograph. William, seated in his usual armchair, looked at his grandson with curiosity. "Ryan, what's going on?" the elderly man asked, noticing the serious expression on his face. Ryan sat across from his grandfather and extended the photo. I met this man today. Edward Wells. He said he fought alongside you in the war, that he was your friend and even saved your life. William took the photo with trembling hands. When his eyes fell on the image, he froze. Edward Wells, he murmured, a distant smile forming. Oh, how could I forget? He didn't just save my life. He was a brother to me out there. He talked a lot about you, Grandpa, Ryan continued. And that's when I realized something. These stories, they're important. They're part of who you are, of who he is. And no one else knows them. William looked at his grandson, intrigued. What are you trying to say, Ryan? I'm saying we need to share these stories. We need to create a space where people like you and Edward can share what you lived through, so no one forgets what you did. The next day, Ryan brought the idea to the police station. Jake, now with a newfound respect for Edward, decided to join him to show his support. The two entered the captain's office confidently but with a touch of nervousness. The captain, a robust man with a perpetually skeptical expression, looked up from his computer. What is it now, boys? Captain, Ryan began, taking a deep breath. We have a proposal. We want to organize an event to honor the veterans in our community. A place where they can share their stories and be recognized. The captain raised an eyebrow, evidently doubtful. An event for veterans? And who's going to pay for it? How do you think this aligns with police work? Jake jumped in, trying to bolster the argument. Captain, think of it as a way to strengthen the relationship between the police and the community. Many of these veterans are part of this city. Their parents, grandparents, friends. Showing that we care can make a big difference. The captain crossed his arms, still looking unconvinced. And why is this suddenly so important to you two? Ryan pulled out the paper Edward had left at the coffee shop. He unfolded it and placed it on the captain's desk. These are the names of the men Edward Wells saved during the war. Men who didn't make it home. He carries these memories every day, in silence. Mr. Wells taught me something. Their service was a sacrifice we can't forget. And I believe it's our duty to give them the opportunity to share their stories. The captain picked up the paper, examining it closely. His expression softened, though he tried to hide it. After a few moments of silence, he placed the paper back on the desk and sighed. All right, he said finally. If this means that much to you, I'll authorize it. But I want you to make sure it's done right. No sloppy improvisations. Organize, plan, and make it worthwhile. Jake and Ryan exchanged looks of relief and satisfaction. Thank you, Captain, Ryan said sincerely. And don't make me regret this, the captain added, turning back to his computer. The planning began immediately. Ryan and Jake contacted local veterans associations, spread the word throughout the community, and secured support from local businesses. Millie, upon hearing about the initiative, volunteered to help, insisting that the coffee shop provide coffee and snacks for the event. While working on the organization, Ryan revisited his grandfather to share the updates. William, visibly moved, promised to attend. Edward will be happy to see me, he said with a warm smile. And I'll be happy to see him too. Jake, for his part, surprised everyone with his dedication. Once skeptical, he now seemed determined to ensure the event's success. It's the least we can do, he told Ryan. After all, it's about respect. The day of the event dawned with a gentle sun. The square, carefully prepared, carried an air of simplicity that matched the purpose of the gathering. Tables were arranged around the central gazebo, which served as a makeshift stage. American flags waved in the breeze, and posters highlighted the day's theme, honoring our heroes. Veterans began arriving in groups, many wearing jackets or hats indicating their military divisions. Some came supported by canes, others in wheelchairs, but all carried something in common: the weight of memory and the dignity of those who lived to tell stories few knew. Edward arrived promptly, with his books and notebooks under his arm and his bravery medal discreetly pinned to his coat. He observed the activity around him with a mix of surprise and emotion. Millie stood by the coffee table, smiling as she spotted him. "Mr. Wells," she called, waving. "You came. We've been waiting for you." Edward slowly approached, his eyes scanning the environment. "I didn't expect something so beautiful," he said, taking in the flags and tables. "You all did a great job." "Ryan and Jake took care of everything," Millie replied proudly. "They really put in the effort." Edward smiled faintly, adjusting his coat. "Well, it seems there's still hope for this generation." Ryan and Jake were on the other side of the square, helping guests get settled. When Ryan saw Edward, he walked over with a warm smile. "Mr. Wells, I'm glad you came," he said, shaking Edward's hand. "Today is your day." "I wouldn't say that," Edward replied humbly. "But I'm grateful to be here." Jake, who had approached discreetly, placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "It's good to see you, Mr. Wells." "I promise no one's going to mock anything today," he said with an embarrassed smile. Edward chuckled softly. "I like seeing people learn. And you're doing a good job here." The event opened with a speech from the police captain. He climbed the small stage, adjusted the microphone, and spoke with a solemn tone. "Today, we gather to honor the veterans who made immense sacrifices for our country. Their stories are part of who we are, and it is our duty to ensure they are never forgotten." The speech was brief but moving. Veterans were then invited to share their experiences. Some took the stage, others preferred to speak from their tables. Stories of camaraderie, challenges overcome, and losses that still left scars were shared. Every word was received with attention and respect. When it was Edward's turn, he walked to the stage with firm, though slow, steps. The crowd fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. "My name is Edward Wells," he began, his voice calm but strong. "I served as a field medic in World War II. I don't consider myself a hero. In fact, I don't think any of us who returned home truly see ourselves that way. But I'm here to share something I believe is important." He pulled out the paper he had left at the coffee shop, holding it up for everyone to see. "The names on this paper are of men I saved but who still didn't make it home. Each one of them was a son, a brother, a friend. They had dreams, hopes, families waiting for them. And they're gone." Edward paused, letting his words sink into the silence of the square. "I carry these names with me because I don't want to forget. Because, to me, each one of them deserves to be remembered. And I believe all of you here have your own lists, maybe not on paper, but in your hearts." His words deeply moved everyone present. Some discreetly wiped away tears, while others nodded, understanding the weight of what he was saying. After Edward's speech, Ryan approached him with a special guest, his grandfather, William Carter. William, seated in a wheelchair, looked at Edward with bright eyes. Edward, upon seeing him, stopped in his tracks, as if unable to believe what he was seeing. "Will," he said, his voice choked. "My old friend." William smiled broadly, extending a trembling hand. "Ed. It's been so long, my brother." The two embraced tightly, a gesture that seemed to carry decades of untold stories. The crowd watched in silence, respecting the moment. It was more than a reunion, it was a piece of history coming to life once again. The sun shone softly on the morning of the event. The square, carefully prepared, carried an air of simplicity that perfectly suited the purpose of the gathering. Tables were arranged around the central gazebo, where a small platform served as an improvised stage. American flags fluttered in the breeze, and posters proudly displayed the day's theme, honoring our heroes. Veterans began arriving in groups, many wearing jackets or hats indicating their military divisions. Some arrived with the aid of canes, others in wheelchairs, but they all shared one thing in common: the weight of memory and the dignity of those who had lived to tell stories that few others could understand. Edward arrived on time, as always, with his books and notebooks under one arm and his bravery medal discreetly pinned to his coat. He observed the movement around him with a mixture of surprise and emotion. Millie stood by the coffee station, smiling as she noticed him. "Mr. Wells," she called, waving to him. "You came. We were waiting for you." Edward approached slowly, his eyes sweeping over the scene. "I didn't expect something so beautiful," he said, his gaze lingering on the flags and tables. "You've all done a wonderful job." "Ryan and Jake took care of everything," Millie replied proudly. "They really put in the effort." Edward smiled faintly, adjusting his coat. "Well, it seems there's still hope for this generation." Ryan and Jake were across the square, helping to seat guests. When Ryan noticed Edward, he walked over with a warm smile. "Mr. Wells, I'm so glad you're here," he said, shaking Edward's hand. "Today is your day." "I wouldn't say that," Edward replied humbly. "But I'm grateful to be here." Jake, who had joined them quietly, placed a hand on Ryan's shoulder. "Good to see you, Mr. Wells." "I promise no one will be mocking anyone today," he said with a sheepish smile. Edward chuckled softly. "It's good to see people learn. You've done a good job here." The event began with a speech from the police captain. He climbed the small stage, adjusted the microphone, and addressed the crowd with a solemn tone. "Today, we gather to honor the veterans who made immense sacrifices for our country. Their stories are part of who we are, and it is our duty to ensure they are never forgotten." The speech was brief but heartfelt. Afterward, veterans were invited to share their experiences. Some stood on the stage, while others spoke from their tables. Stories of camaraderie, challenges overcome, and losses that still haunted them were shared. Each word was met with quiet respect and attention. When Edward's turn came, he walked to the stage with steady, though deliberate, steps. The crowd fell silent as he adjusted the microphone. "My name is Edward Wells," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I served as a field medic in World War II. I don't consider myself a hero. In fact, I don't think any of us who returned home truly see ourselves that way. But I'm here to share something I believe is important." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the piece of paper he had left at the coffee shop, holding it up for the audience to see. "The names on this paper belong to men I saved but who didn't make it home. Each one was a son, a brother, a friend. They had dreams, hopes, families waiting for them. And they're gone." Edward paused, letting the gravity of his words settle over the audience. "I carry these names with me because I refuse to forget them. Because, to me, each one of them deserves to be remembered. And I believe each of you here has your own lists, maybe not on paper, but in your hearts." His words deeply moved everyone present. Some wiped away tears discreetly, while others nodded, the weight of his message evident on their faces. After Edward's speech, Ryan approached him with a special guest, his grandfather, William Carter. William, seated in a wheelchair, looked at Edward with bright eyes. Upon seeing him, Edward stopped in his tracks, as if unable to believe what he was seeing. "Will," Edward said, his voice thick with emotion. "My old friend." William smiled broadly, extending a trembling hand. "Ed. It's been so long, my brother." The two embraced tightly, a gesture that seemed to hold decades of untold stories. The crowd watched in reverent silence, understanding the significance of the moment. It was more than a reunion, it was a piece of history being brought to life once again. For hours afterward, Edward and William sat at a table apart from the crowd, reminiscing about their time in the war and sharing stories of how their lives had unfolded since. Ryan and Jake, watching from a distance, felt a sense of renewed pride for organizing the event. "This turned out to be so much more than I expected," Jake said, crossing his arms. "I think I finally understand what Mr. Wells meant about respect." Ryan nodded. "Me too. And I don't think I'll ever forget this." The event concluded with a round of applause for all the veterans present. As Edward left the square, he looked at Millie, Ryan, and Jake and said, "Thank you for this. You've done more than you realize." As Edward walked away, Millie smiled and said, "I think he's done more for us than we've done for him." A few months had passed since the event in the square. The town was still buzzing about that special day when local veterans shared their stories and relived memories in an atmosphere of respect and admiration. Ryan and Jake, profoundly impacted by the event's success and the lessons they had learned, decided to carry the idea forward. On that sunny morning, a small group gathered once again in the square, this time for an even more significant occasion. A new plaque had been installed at the entrance, where it now read, "Heroes Square, in tribute to our veterans." Edward was there, dressed in his faithful coat and carrying his cane, standing beside William Carter, who sat in a wheelchair but wore a rejuvenated smile. Millie was also present, with a large thermos and cups of coffee for everyone. Ryan and Jake, dressed in their uniforms, had taken on the responsibility of leading the simple but meaningful ceremony. "Today is about more than just naming this square," Ryan began, addressing the small audience. "It's a day to remember that the sacrifices made by those who served should never be forgotten. This plaque is a symbol, but the true legacy lies in the stories we heard and the lessons we learned from people like Edward Wells and William Carter." Jake, still adjusting to public speaking, took over next. "I used to think that badges and uniforms were about authority. But I've learned they mean responsibility. And I owe that realization to a man who had the patience to teach us. Thank you, Mr. Wells." Edward, who had been listening intently, nodded, a faint smile crossing his face. He seemed smaller in stature but larger in presence, as if the moment reflected his entire journey. This time, he chose not to take the stage. Instead, he remained seated beside William, observing with quiet pride. After the ceremony concluded, the crowd began to disperse, but Edward stayed seated, watching the children now playing in the square. William remained by his side, both of them silent, as if sharing a conversation without words. Millie approached with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Edward. "Looks like you've become a local legend," she joked, sitting beside him. Edward chuckled softly. "Legends are just exaggerated stories, my dear. I'm simply a man who was lucky enough to come home." Ryan and Jake, after chatting with a few veterans and community members, also approached. Ryan seemed hesitant but finally spoke. "Mr. Wells, I want to thank you again. None of this would have happened without you." Edward looked at the 2 young officers, pride evident on his face. "You have the potential to do great things," he said. "Just remember, it's not about you. It's about the people you serve." Jake nodded, clearly moved. "We'll remember that. Always." As the sun began to set and the remaining crowd trickled away, Edward remained seated, watching the horizon where the first stars started to appear. He thought of his companions, the names he carried on that small piece of paper, and felt an unfamiliar peace. The memories were painful, but now they carried a greater purpose. William, sitting beside him, broke the silence. "They would be proud of you, Ed. All of them." Edward took a deep breath, nodding slightly. "I just hope I've done enough." As night fell, the square felt more alive than ever. The light posts illuminated the newly installed plaque, and the laughter of children echoed alongside the quiet conversations of adults. Edward looked around and realized that, in some way, he had finally found a way to come home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave a comment, and check out our next story.